All right, so for experienced Twain scholars, you will learn nothing from this paper. So you can just nod off if you need to. Okay, so Mark Twain was a virtual connoisseur of cowardice, particularly as embodied and promulgated by white men. He was fascinated by those crossroad moments that reveal the weakness of a character or a culture, and he was equally interested in the facile notions of male heroism and the zeal with which Americans embraced them. I had a couple of really snarky pictures of Pete Hegseth and Kash Patel, but I felt that was too juvenile, so I cut. Today I'd like to discuss cowardice and heroism, and how these themes converge for Twain at the beginning of the 20th century at some very dangerous and very real crossroads. By the time Twain completes Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in 1885, lynchings are occurring throughout the United States, from Nebraska to Montana to Alabama to Missouri. Many are being photographed, with the corpse displayed like the spoils of a successful hunt, turned into postcards, then traded as souvenirs. In 1901, the year that Twain writes The United States of Lyncherdom, there were 130 lynchings. 105 of those victims were Black Americans. There's no question that Twain was repulsed by the indiscriminate, sadistic violence inflicted upon African Americans during his lifetime. And as evidenced by his unsigned 1869 editorial, Only an N-Word, he was keenly aware that the lost cause myth-making was deployed to justify grotesque treatment of Black people. My focus today, however, is less on his moral outrage than on his decision not to directly, clearly express it, and the habit of literary critics to ignore or gild that decision. After an intense period of writing The United States of Lyncherdom, Twain pigeonholed it. That decision has been an embarrassment for white Twain scholars, who have generally avoided contextualizing or exploring that decision, while public intellectuals and fans have overall ignored it. My goal here is not to indict Twain. After all, who isn't a coward? More to the point, he indicts himself. He writes in his autobiography, "The human race is a race of cowards, and I am not only marching in that procession, but carrying the banner." Instead, I'd like to excite conversation around current efforts to paint Twain as a hero, in particular, a white hero, and how those efforts have been woven into a new wave of lost cause myth-making and the whitewashing of American history. Twain writes about lynching directly or indirectly in all his major works. Perhaps his most profound indictment of the kind of whiteness and masculinity that fuels a lynching is in the confrontation between Colonel Sherburne and the lynch mob led by the half-man Harness. In the look and sound of the passage, Twain reproduces the carnival frenzy that surrounded the lynching of so many Black people in post-bellum Jim Crow America. Yet he also cloaks and marginalizes that specific context. When the lynch mob swarmed up the street toward Sherburne's house, the Black population keeps a strategic distance. There was N-word boys in every tree and bucks and wenches looking over every fence. And as soon as the mob would get nearly to them, they would break and scattle back out of reach. Out of reach of what? And why? Clearly, the answer is a swarming white mob, but the question is never posed in the narrative. When the slaves in the scene, quote, break and scattle back out of reach, Twain gestures toward the community most threatened by a mob of white vigilantes. But he narrates the threat to the propertied, genteel white Sherburne. Jacqueline Goldsby describes Twain's representations of lynching, not only in Huck Finn, but also in Connecticut Yankee and Pudd'nhead Wilson as, quote, allegories meant to criticize the nation's long-standing tolerance of racial violence. But as these scenes unfold, they turn into narrative digressions that only go to diminish the point of Twain's including them at all. In 1901, Twain has chosen no longer to rely on metaphor or allegory. After reading about the lynching of 3 Black men in Pierce City, Missouri, I must have missed a slide. Pierce City, Missouri, On August 20th, an August 20th report from the Associated Press describes the events. Pierce City, where Will Godley and French Godley, the former's grandfather, were lynched last night as the result of the murder of Ms. Cassile Wild, is today in the hands of hundreds of armed men who are intent on driving all Negroes from the town. All Negro houses in the city are being fired upon by the whites, and one Negro, Pete Hampton, is said to have been cremated in his home. Most of the Negroes have left Pierce City, abandoning their homes, which have been burned. This incident, which resonated forcibly with Twain, in part because of his Missouri origins, prefigures another notorious assault upon the rights, property, and lives of Black Americans, the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. Twain recognizes that he's living at a moment in history, from the end of the Civil War to the dawning of the 20th century, when violence against Black Americans isn't just sanctioned, it's relished. According to Terry Eigel, and I will strongly urge anyone interested in the United States of Lyncherdom to take a look at Terry's essay, the Chicago Tribune had been annually reporting national lynching statistics since 1882. Clemens knew of this annual record, which was reprinted in newspapers across the country and in other publications. Initially, Twain intends to build on this documentary effort. In a 1901 letter to publisher Frank Bliss, he proposes, quote, a large subscription book to be called History of Lynching in America, Rise and Progress of Lynching, or some such title. The scope of the project that he imagines indicates not only how pervasive the crime of lynching was, but that Twain was keenly aware of it. He asks Bliss to hire a researcher, quote, for I want the details of all the lynchings, from the earliest days down to the present. There may be 3,000 of them. By late August 1901, Twain writes The United States of Lyncherdom, which he describes as an acid article on the subject. It is an advertisement for the book, if he publishes it, or he may, quote, reserve it as an introduction. In his response to the tragedy of the Missouri lynching, Twain characterizes the white citizens of Pierce City as assassins who should hang. Twain credits the, quote, inborn human instinct to imitate as the primary force behind lynching. And its other name is moral cowardice, and is the supreme feature of the makeup of 9,999 men in the 10,000. To stop what he sees as a kind of perverse fad, Twain seems to be looking for a few good men. And really, who isn't? Okay. In many ways, the essay, I just had to break it up, it's kind of a heavy paper. In many ways, the essay echoes the rhetorical strategies at work in the Sherburne episode, where lynching is primarily an example of cowardice and a puffed-up expression of failed, spineless masculinity. And as a result, the racial context is deflected. It's not until he begins to survey the scope and pattern of lynchings that Twain engages the racial animus that inspires these crimes. Lynching has reached Colorado, it has reached California, it has reached Indiana, and now Missouri. I shall live to see a Negro burned in Union Square, New York, with 50,000 people present and not a sheriff visible, not a governor, not a constable, not a colonel, not a clergy, not a law and order representative of any sort. And I will say, a couple of the papers recently have been sort of indicating how relevant and present a lot of Twain's writing is, and I think this feels frighteningly current. While the Pierce City lynchings are the initial provocation for Twain's essay, he clearly sees the incident not as exceptional, but as part of an expanding pattern and, quote, epidemic of insanities. One of the first documented uses of the terms racism is during the 1903 Lake Mohonk Conference of the Friends of the Indian. But it's not until 1933 that the term represents a specific ideology of race-based hatred. Twain may not have been familiar with the word, but he understands the concept. Despite his desire to generalize the causes of lynching and to point to human weakness as its source, Twain recognizes the racial motivations at work. He returns repeatedly to the fact that Black people are consistently and deliberately targeted. We shall add 60 lynchings to our 88 before the year is out. We shall reach the 300 mark next, the 500 mark in 1903. We shall lynch 1,000 Negroes in 1904. In 1905, there will be lynchings in every state and territory and possession, for our morals follow the flag. Let the Constitution do as it may. And by 1910, my prediction will mature, and I will see a Negro burned in Union Square. For murder? No. For being in the country against the country's will. By that time, we shall be known as the United States of Lyncherdom. The argument in this acid article is, like many of Twain's engagements with issues of race, reliably uneven. By suggesting that lynching is an epidemic, a kind of physiological phenomenon, he marginalizes the way lynching was part of a strategic, planned, conscious assault on Black autonomy and citizenship. And throughout the essay, he tacitly accepts the fiction that Black men have a proclivity to rape white women. Still, as he describes the violent assaults upon African Americans, including a particularly grotesque and notorious lynching in Texas, Twain's moral outrage is exceeded only by his visceral disgust. In the last line of the essay, Twain seems to recognize lynching as an intentional practice that sustains white supremacy within our culture. Quote, for our morals follow our flag. In his painstaking analysis of the text, Ogle rightly describes the United States of Lyncherdom as, quote, a powerful statement by an outspoken writer of international authority against the atrocity of lynching and the horror of rule by force. And yet, and this is me, Twain chooses not to publish this powerful statement. The essay remains pigeonholed until 1923, when his biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, includes a redacted version in Europe and elsewhere. It's this version, which Ogle describes as greatly diminished by Paine's revisions, that appears in most subsequent publications. Given the enthusiasm with which Twain first proposes the book-length project, his decision not to publish Lyncherdom is striking. And I know this shows a real moral emptiness in myself, but I find this hysterical, his response. He says, in his initial response, he imagines the rise and progress of lynching will be as influential as it is profitable. The book ought to make a sensation from here to Siberia. I shall write in a way calculated to be most effective. No book is as marketable as this one. The field is fresh, untrodden, and of the strongest interest. Now, I don't know whether to loathe him for that, or I just this is so Twain. He's going to make a fortune off of this. By August 29th, however, he's withdrawn from that field and abandoned not only his plan for the book, but also his plan to publish the United States of Lyncherdom. He writes again to Bliss, "No, upon reflection, it won't do for me to write that book, for I shouldn't have even half a friend left down there after it issued from the press. You have probably already thought of that. It is a pity. I think I could make a book that would make a splendid stir. In fact, I know it. I shan't destroy the article I have written, but I see it won't do to print it. I shall keep it and wait. There is considerable vitriol in it, and that will keep it from spoiling. But somebody ought to write that book, and now. I wish I could think of the right man." In 1901, if Mark Twain is not the right man, it's hard to imagine who would be. Most critics have ignored his decision not to publish Lyncherdom. Others have treated his decision as inconsequential. Some have oddly presented it as evidence that Twain, and this is a direct quote, did not avert his eyes to the suffering of African Americans, and that he was among the few writers of his time, white or black, who tackled it directly. Unlike so many of his defenders, however, Twain is a more honest broker. He admits the powerful lure of his own self-interest, and he contemplates the comfort we feel by being part of a crowd, and the security we find by hiding and running away. Writing during an era that would see crusading journalists Nellie Bly, Stephen Crane, Jacob Riis, and especially Ida B. Wells confront a range of social ills, including lynching, Twain chose not to publish the United States of Lyncherdom. It may be that Twain based his decision solely on material concerns. Publication would threaten his profits, affect his reputation, and disturb his peace. These concerns should also have prevented him from publishing To the Person Sitting in Darkness and To My Missionary Critics, both of which were published in 1901. Unlike the oppressive behavior of Christian missionaries in China, however, the fact of lynching in America raises issues for Twain that hit psychologically and geographically closer to home. In The Letter to Bliss, Twain sounds like the white moderate Reverend Martin Luther King describes in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, who, quote, lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season, end quote. Despite his sense that somebody ought to act now, Twain chooses to wait. William Dean Howells described Twain as the most de-Southernized Southerner he ever knew, but it is precisely his desire to be accepted by his friends in the South that causes Twain to mute and nuance his public response to lynching. Just as Huck recedes into the crowd at the end of the Sherburne incident, I could have stayed if I wanted to, but I didn't want to, Twain chooses not to antagonize the community that supports him, a community that may be labeled white or Southern or male or some combination of them all. And it's his loyalty to the half-friend in the South that makes Twain the kind of half-man he disdains elsewhere. I recently had a conversation with a younger colleague, and I realized that does not narrow the field at all for any of you. Who suggested we no longer need to worry about the St. Mark's School of Criticism, that we had arrived at a moment when complex racial arguments about Twain's works were in fact the rule and not the exception. And I think listening to some of the work that we have around us today, I understand why he might feel that way. But if we stay in the confines of academia, my friend might be right. But if we look beyond, I'm not so sure. Let's look at what's happening out there. The stunningly successful erasure of Black history from public spaces, from high school texts, college curriculums, and classrooms, now from the Smithsonian, ICE raids randomly targeting people of color, the constant need to prove that Black lives matter. At the same time, the hero, Mark Twain, continues to be venerated. We've been schooled by select critics who insist that Twain's use of the N-word is unquestionably ironic, and we're still talking about that Jim was and is entirely a noble character, the product of a noble imagination, and that Twain's racial politics were pure. Twain himself has made it into Donald Trump's proposed Garden of Heroes, alongside other great American heroes, Kobe Bryant, Lauren Bacall, and the Canadian Alex Trebek. Of course, the project is absurd, but it suggests how easily Twain can be bleached and co-opted to fit a simplistic version of America's racial history. We see a little bit of this in Ron Chernow's recent essay, and no, I have not finished the biography. His recent essay in The Atlantic, where he concludes that no other white author of the late 19th century engaged so fully with the Black community, whether in promoting the Fisk Jubilee Singers or paying the expenses for a Black law student at Yale Law School, end quote. It's unclear to me what it means to fully engage with the Black community, but it appears that Twain has won a contest. No other white author, not George Washington Cable or Thomas Wentworth Higginson or even William Dean Howells, and listening to Matt's talk today, I'd add James Redpath. No other white author, except and only Twain, wins the prize for most fully engaging with the Black community. Chernow's conclusion is as anodyne as it is predictable. Twain's identity as white hero has, over the decades, become a kind of mathematical equation. Add up his admirable support of Walter McGinn and Booker T. Washington, his love of Black culture and certain Black people, subtract his nostalgia for the good old-fashioned Negro, his affection for minstrelsy and the N-word, ignore the fact that in 1894 in Paris he once dressed as Uncle Remus in blackface, and at the end of the calculation you have the most de-Southernized Southerner, the ideal white man, the anti-racist hero, Mark Twain. When he accepted the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, Conan O'Brien celebrated the fact that Twain hated bullies, empathized with the weak, and that given the opportunity, he punched up, not down. This is the Mark Twain who inspires not only the popular culture, but many of us here today. Twain, the American lion, irreverent, rebellious, resilient, and I'm going to end with a couple of closing ironies. I was on the committee that helped to choose this image. Okay, think about that. I love a heroic Mark Twain, but I'm deeply suspicious, even afraid of the icon, the hero, Mark Twain. Next, I'll admit that I greatly admire the artistry of Mark Twain. I teared up a bit when Conan praised him for honoring the glorious mess of being human. Nonetheless, I think as biographers, teachers, critics, and citizens, especially now, we need to call out representations that don't give him the grace to be fully human, that doesn't acknowledge that while he recoiled at most forms of American racism, he occasionally fell victim to his own. In other words, any effort that doesn't honor the fabulously human mess of Mark Twain. Thank you.